Princess Kayla stared out at the stars, her heart heavy with the weight of her father's betrayal. She had always believed in the power of family, in the love of her father, the king of the Villari. But that belief was shattered when her father, desperate to save his kingdom from a crushing galactic debt, made a decision that would change her life forever. He sold her, his own daughter, into slavery. Her chains clinked softly as she shifted, trying to find a comfortable position in the small dark cell. The cold metal against her skin was a constant reminder of her new reality. The Villari people, known for their ethereal beauty and advanced technology, had long held power in the galaxy, but that power meant little now. All her status, her title, and the respect she once commanded were gone. Now she was nothing more than a piece of property. The ship that held her was heading toward the Corvith Empire, one of the most feared and ruthless slave markets in the galaxy. The thought of what awaited her there made her stomach turn. She had heard the stories, how the Corvith treated their slaves as little more than tools for their entertainment. The gladiator arenas, the constant violence. It was a world Kayla could never have imagined in her wildest nightmares. As the ship drifted through the cold expanse of space, Kayla's mind raced. How had it come to this? She had always been a good daughter, loyal to her people, trying her best to be the future leader her father wanted her to be. But now, none of that mattered. Her life had been traded for gold and power. Her father had chosen his kingdom over her, and she was powerless to change that. Tears welled up in Kayla's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Crying wouldn't help her now. She had to stay strong. There had to be a way out of this. She didn't know how or when, but she couldn't accept a life of endless pain and humiliation. The ship's artificial gravity flickered, and Kayla's attention was drawn to the small window in the corner of the cell. Outside, the stars blinked in the vastness of space. For a moment, she forgot the pain, the fear, and the humiliation. She was still a princess, after all. She still had hope, didn't she? Suddenly, the door to her cell opened, and a tall, armored figure entered. The guard, a Corvath soldier, stood in the doorway, staring at her with cold, calculating eyes. "Move," he ordered, his voice gruff and harsh. Kayla didn't respond immediately. She had been given many commands in her life, but none had felt as degrading as this one. She stood slowly, her movements stiff from the long journey. As she walked past the soldier, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze on her. She had become nothing more than an object to these people, an object to be used, to be sold, to be broken. They led her to a large chamber filled with other captives, various species from across the galaxy. Most of them were too weak to resist, their spirits crushed by the harsh treatment they had already endured. Kayla was different. She refused to let them break her, even if she had no idea how to escape. A few hours later, the ship landed at a massive station on the outskirts of the Corvith Empire. The station was a dark, intimidating place, filled with the sounds of shouting, the clanking of metal, and the general chaos of a slave market. The air was thick with the scent of fear and desperation. Kayla could hear the screams of those who had already been sold, their fates sealed. The guards herded the slaves into a large holding pen, where they would wait until they were auctioned off. Kayla's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen slave markets before, but never from this side of the fence. She had heard the rumors, the stories of how slaves were treated once they entered the arena, and none of them were good. But as she stood in the crowded pen, Kayla couldn't shake the feeling that someone, would change her fate. She didn't know how, but she couldn't just accept this life of suffering. She had to fight. In the far corner of the pen, there was a small group of new captives. One of them caught her attention. He was different from the others, tall, strong, and undeniably human. His eyes, a deep shade of brown, held a quiet confidence that stood out even among the defeated. His name was Elias Voss, and Kayla had heard whispers of his capture. A human warrior, once a captain in the Earth's military, now reduced to a slave like the rest of them. But Kayla knew something others didn't. There was a fire in Elias's eyes, a defiance that Kayla could feel from across the room. He wasn't like the others. He was a fighter. And maybe, just maybe, he could show her how to fight back. As the guards called for the next group to be taken to the auction, Kayla found herself staring at Elias, her heart pounding. There was something about him, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. The days after Kayla arrived at the Corvath slave market were long and filled with uncertainty. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the harsh commands of the guards and the cold, impersonal transactions of slaves being sold. Kayla's heart hardened with each passing hour as she was forced to endure the brutal reality of her new life. Yet, in the chaos of her captivity, one thing stood out, one person among the many. His name was Elias Voss, and he was unlike anyone Kayla had ever encountered. Kayla had heard stories about the human warrior, a captain from Earth who had been captured during a failed mission to rescue slaves from a Corvath facility. His reputation as a fighter was already well known throughout the slave quarters, and it was no surprise why. Elias moved with a confidence that set him apart from the other prisoners. He never bowed his head, never showed fear, and he treated every guard with a look of defiance that could not be ignored. When Elias first entered the holding pen, Kayla had watched from a distance. He was tall, his broad shoulders covered by the tattered remnants of his uniform. His hair was dark and kept short, and his face bore the marks of someone who had fought many battles. But what struck Kayla the most were his eyes, deep, brown, and filled with something that Kayla had thought she had lost: hope. The other slaves eyed him with a mixture of awe and fear, but Kayla couldn't look away. She had seen many captives come and go, but none of them had ever carried themselves with such strength. Elias was different. He wasn't broken. He didn't appear to accept his fate. He was a fighter. As the days passed, Kayla found herself watching him more and more. Elias was a natural leader. Though no one dared speak to him directly, his presence seemed to inspire the other slaves. When one of them was too weak to work, Elias would step in, carrying the burden without complaint. When a fight broke out in the pen, Elias was always the first to intervene, not with violence, but with a calm, steady voice that carried authority. It was clear that Elias was no ordinary prisoner. He was a soldier, a strategist, and a protector. But Kayla couldn't help but wonder, why hadn't he tried to escape yet? If anyone had the strength to break free, it was him. Why stay in this hellhole? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the slave quarters, Kayla found herself sitting alone by the small window in her cell. Her mind was racing, thoughts of escape swirling in her head. But she had no idea where to begin. She had no weapons, no allies, and no way of knowing what lay beyond the walls of the prison station. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. She tensed, expecting another guard, but the sound was different, steady, purposeful. She turned her head and saw Elias standing just outside her cell. His brown eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a strange connection in the air, an unspoken understanding. "Why are you still here?" Kayla asked, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. "You don't have to be. You could have escaped by now." Elias studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here by choice," he said softly, "but I'm not going to leave anyone behind. Not while there's still a chance to fight." Kayla felt a flicker of something deep within her chest. She had never met anyone like Elias before. The other slaves had long since given up on the idea of escape, resigned to their fate. But Elias, he refused to give in. And that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out after all. "I don't know if I can escape," Kayla admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't live like this. I won't." Elias nodded, as if he understood. "You don't have to do it alone," he said quietly. "There are more of us, you know. More who haven't given up. You just have to believe it's possible." Kayla felt her heart beat faster as she looked into his eyes. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a spark of hope. Elias had offered her something she hadn't realized she was missing. A way forward, a way out. He had shown her that it was possible to fight back against the darkness that had swallowed her life. In that moment, Kayla made a promise to herself. She would find a way to escape. She didn't know how or when, but she would do it. And Elias would be the one who helped her. As the days passed, Kayla found herself spending more time with Elias, learning from him, listening to his stories about Earth, about the battles he had fought, and the ideals he lived by. His words became a source of strength for her, and the more she learned about him, the more she admired his resilience. Elias spoke little of his past, but Kayla could see the pain in his eyes whenever he mentioned Earth. He missed his home, his people, but he also believed in something bigger than himself, something that had kept him fighting even in the darkest of times. It was that belief, Kayla realized, that had kept him alive. Together, they began to plan. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but Kayla now had something she hadn't had before, a sense of purpose. She would fight for her freedom. She would fight for a future where she could choose her own destiny. And with Elias by her side, she believed that anything was possible. The days in the Korvath slave quarters passed slowly, each one marked by the rhythm of hard labor and harsh commands. But for Kayla, something had shifted. The spark of hope Elias had ignited in her continued to grow. She no longer spent her days resigned to despair. Now, each moment was filled with the quiet determination to find a way out. It wasn't just Elias's words that kept her going. It was his actions. Every day, Elias worked alongside the other slaves, teaching them how to survive, how to stand tall in the face of impossible odds. Though many remained fearful, Kayla saw the change in them. Elias had a quiet strength, a leadership that wasn't forced but earned. It was this that made him different from the others. Where many had given up, Elias had never stopped fighting. One evening, as the prisoners were gathered in the communal area after their daily work, Elias approached Kayla. She had been standing by the edge of the room, staring out at the dark horizon through a small window. It was the same view she had seen for days, but today it felt different. The stars in the sky didn't seem as distant. They seemed within reach. Elias's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're quiet today," he said softly. Kayla turned to face him, offering a small smile. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said, about fighting back." Elias nodded, as though expecting the conversation. "It's not easy, but nothing worth having ever is." Kayla's gaze dropped to the floor, her thoughts swirling. She knew what Elias said was true. She had witnessed the horrors of the Korvath Empire, seen how they used the slaves in their cruel gladiator arenas, but she hadn't truly understood what it meant to fight back until now. It wasn't just about escaping, though that was the first step. It was about reclaiming something more valuable: dignity. "I don't know where to begin," Kayla confessed. "I've never fought before. I don't even know how to survive here." "You're already surviving," Elias said with a smile. "The first step is believing that you can. The rest comes after." Kayla's chest tightened at his words. She had always been taught to rely on others, to trust in the protection of her family and her kingdom. But now, in this place, it was clear that survival depended on her own strength. There was no one coming to save her. She had to save herself. "I'll help you," Elias continued, "one step at a time. We'll start small, learning how to protect yourself, how to move unnoticed. There's no guarantee we'll make it out of here, but every day we stay alive is a victory." Kayla nodded slowly, her mind shifting from fear to determination. This was her chance. This was the beginning of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for: freedom. In the days that followed, Elias taught her everything he knew. He showed her how to move with purpose, how to avoid the guards' watchful eyes, how to use the environment to her advantage. Every lesson, no matter how small, made her stronger. With each new skill, Kayla felt a growing sense of confidence. She was no longer just a slave in chains. She was a fighter, just like Elias. It wasn't easy. The guards were ever watchful, and any misstep could lead to punishment. But Elias was always there, a constant presence beside her, guiding her through the challenges. Kayla had never imagined that she would be in a position to fight back, but as the days passed, she could see that Elias had made her believe it was possible. One night, after a long day of training, Elias pulled Kayla aside. The others were still in their cells, resting from the grueling tasks of the day. The quiet of the night wrapped around them as Elias's voice broke the stillness. "You're stronger than you think, Kayla," he said, his gaze steady. "But strength isn't just about physical power. It's about knowing when to fight and when to wait." Kayla met his gaze, feeling a sense of trust she had never thought possible. Elias wasn't just teaching her how to survive. He was teaching her how to think, to plan, to fight with purpose. It wasn't just about breaking free from the Corveth Empire. It was about making sure that when the time came, she would be ready for whatever came next. "I'll be ready," Kayla said, her voice filled with determination. "When the time comes, I'll be ready." Elias's lips curved into a small smile. "I know you will." The weeks that followed were filled with more training and more planning. The slave quarters were tense with whispers of rebellion, of escape, but Kayla knew that a rushed attempt would only lead to failure. The key to their success would be patience. It wasn't enough to have the strength to fight back. They needed to have the cunning to outsmart their captors. As Kayla and Elias worked together, a bond formed between them, stronger than any chain. Kayla began to see Elias not just as a fellow prisoner, but as someone who had become her ally, her partner, her friend. He had shown her the true meaning of hope, and she would not let that hope fade. No matter what came, Kayla knew that with Elias by her side, she could face the future. Together, they would fight for freedom, and together, they would find a way out of this nightmare. The days in the Corveth prison had begun to blend together. The harsh routines, the endless work, the cold metal walls, they were all the same. But in Kayla's heart, a new fire had been lit. With each passing day, her confidence grew, and so did her bond with Elias. They no longer just trained in silence. They spoke openly about what needed to be done to escape. The plan was starting to take shape, and for the first time, Kayla could see a way out. Elias was meticulous in his planning. He had spent countless hours studying the movements of the guards, the layout of the prison, and the best ways to evade detection. He knew that escape would not be easy. The prison was heavily fortified, and the Corvath were always on high alert. But Elias had learned one thing through his years of fighting and surviving. There was always a weakness, a crack in the armor, and he was determined to find it. One night, after everyone had settled into their cells for the evening, Elias approached Kayla in the dimly lit hallway. They had been waiting for a moment like this, when the guards would be at their most distracted. "Tonight's the night," Elias whispered, his voice steady but filled with purpose. Kayla's heart raced. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. They had talked about escape many times, but now that it was happening, everything felt different. This wasn't just a dream anymore. It was real. "Are we ready?" Kayla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded. "We have everything we need. We just have to move quickly and stay quiet. If we're careful, we can make it to the ventilation shafts. From there, we'll find a way to the outer walls." Kayla took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The moment that would determine her future. Would she escape, or would she fail and remain trapped in this nightmare forever? Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, sensing her fear. "You've got this, Kayla. You've been preparing for this. Trust yourself." She nodded, trying to steady her breath. Elias's words gave her strength. He had been her mentor, her friend, her source of hope. Now she had to trust that everything they had worked for would pay off. As the guards made their rounds, Kayla and Elias slipped out of their cells and into the shadows. They moved swiftly and quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick stone floors. The guards were too far away to hear them, lost in their own routines, but they couldn't afford to relax. Every step was a risk. They reached the first checkpoint, a narrow hallway guarded by a Korvath soldier who had just stepped into view. Elias signaled to Kayla, and they both flattened against the wall, holding their breath. The soldier walked past, his footsteps echoing in the distance, and they were able to continue. "Keep moving," Elias murmured, his voice barely audible. The two of them crept through the dark corridors, navigating the prison with the precision of a well-rehearsed plan. They had studied every inch of this place. They knew the hidden paths, the weak points in the security systems, and the timing of the guard shifts. The longer they moved undetected, the more confident Kayla became. Finally, they'd reached the ventilation shaft. It was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for them to crawl through, but it was their only way forward. Elias carefully removed the vent cover, and they both slipped inside. The air was musty and stale, but it was better than being caught in the open. Kayla crawled through the dark, following Elias, who was leading the way. They moved quickly, but carefully, aware of every noise, every shadow. The ventilation system wound through the prison like a maze, twisting and turning as they made their way toward the outer walls. Kayla's muscles ached from the effort, but she pushed forward. She couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. As they neared the end of the shaft, they could hear the hum of machinery from the outside, the sound of the prison's outer walls. They were almost there, but then suddenly, a loud alarm blared through the air, echoing through the corridors. Kayla's heart stopped. The guards had discovered they were gone. Elias cursed under his breath. "We've been spotted. Move." They scrambled to the exit, but the noise of the alarm was deafening, and the pressure of being hunted added to their desperation. The vent cover flew off, and they dropped to the ground outside the prison walls. Kayla looked up, her eyes wide with fear and hope. They were free. The cold night air hit her face, but she didn't care. They had escaped the prison, but now they had to survive in the unknown. Elias looked at Kayla, his face hard with determination. "We've only just begun. We're not safe yet. We need to get to the rebellion's safe house." Kayla nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had escaped the prison, but the battle was far from over. She had no idea what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for sure. Elias had shown her that there was always a way out, always a chance to fight back. Together, they would continue their journey, facing the unknown with the strength they had found in each other. And they would never stop fighting for their freedom. The cold night air was a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the Korvath prison. Kayla's breath came in quick bursts as she and Elias raced through the darkened landscape. The alarm had already echoed through the prison walls, and they knew time was running out. They had to reach the rebellion's safe house before the Korvath could track them down. Elias led the way, his movements steady and calculated, while Kayla followed close behind. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the past had finally caught up with her. But she refused to stop. The feeling of freedom, of finally being outside the prison walls, was too precious to squander. She would keep going, no matter how tired or scared she felt. The land around them was unfamiliar. Dark forests stretched out in every direction, the trees towering over them like silent sentinels. The only light came from the distant stars, dimly illuminating the path ahead. There were no roads, no signs, no markers to guide them. It was just the two of them against the vast unknown. Kayla glanced at Elias. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. He was just as determined as she was, but she knew the danger they were in. The Korvath were ruthless, and they would not rest until they had recaptured their escaped slaves. They had to move quickly, but cautiously. One wrong step, and they would be back where they started, trapped. "Do you think we can make it?" Kayla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias glanced over his shoulder, his brown eyes steady. "We don't have a choice," he said quietly. "We make it or we die trying." Kayla swallowed hard. She had never faced anything like this before. Back home, her life had been sheltered and comfortable. She had never known what it was like to live with such constant fear, to run for her life every moment of every day. But now, with Elias by her side, she realized something. She had always thought she was helpless, that her fate was something she couldn't control. But that wasn't true anymore. Her heart filled with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just running from the past. She was running toward something better. The future was uncertain, but she wasn't alone. Elias had shown her that they could fight back, that there was always a chance to win. They continued through the dense woods, moving quickly but silently. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made Kayla's heart race. She was terrified, but she couldn't let that fear control her. Elias had taught her to trust in her instincts, and right now, her instincts told her to keep moving. After what felt like hours of running, they reached a small clearing. Elias stopped and motioned for Kayla to do the same. They crouched low, hidden by the thick trees that surrounded them. The sounds of the night seemed louder now, an owl's call in the distance, the whisper of the wind through the branches. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of Kayla's neck stand on end. Footsteps. Elias held up his hand, signaling for silence. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. Kayla followed his gaze, her breath held tight in her chest. In the distance, she could just make out the faint glow of lights. The Korvath were close, too close. "We need to move," Elias murmured, his voice calm but urgent. Kayla's heart raced as they quickly and quietly changed direction, moving away from the clearing and deeper into the forest. Her legs burned from the effort, but she pushed on. She had to keep up. She had to stay with Elias. They moved for what felt like another hour, the sound of the Korvath growing fainter behind them. When they finally stopped again, Kayla was out of breath, her body aching from the strain. Elias didn't seem tired at all, his eyes always scanning the area, his senses sharp. "We need to rest," Kayla said, her voice shaking from exhaustion. Elias hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We'll rest, but not for long. We can't afford to stop for too long." They sat together in the shadows, hidden by the thick underbrush. Kayla pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. Elias sat beside her, his back against a tree, eyes ever watchful. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comforting, the shared sense of urgency and trust connecting them in a way words never could. Kayla could feel the bond between them growing stronger, their shared experiences shaping something deeper than just a partnership. Elias wasn't just her ally. He was her protector, her guide, and perhaps something more. "I never thought I'd be here," Kayla said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I never thought I'd be running from my own people, my own life." Elias looked at her, his expression softening for the first time in what felt like forever. "None of us ever expect it. Life has a way of throwing us into the unknown. But what matters is how we face it. You're not running away from your life. You're running toward the chance to rebuild it. And you're not doing it alone." Kayla looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Elias gave a small smile, the weight of the world still resting on his shoulders, but his eyes filled with something warm, something she hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together." As they sat there in the dark, Kayla felt a renewed sense of strength. They had escaped, but they weren't free yet. The path ahead would be full of challenges, of dangers they couldn't even begin to imagine. But one thing was certain. Together, they would face whatever came. They would fight for their future, for their freedom. And Kayla knew, deep in her heart, that they would not give up. The journey through the forest was long, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. Every step Kayla took felt heavier than the last, her body aching from the exhaustion of the escape. But Elias was always beside her, his presence a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. They had come so far, and yet the journey was only just beginning. Kayla's thoughts kept drifting back to the prison. The cold walls, the harsh guards, the cruel treatment of the slaves. She had been trapped in that place for so long, unable to see any way out. But now, out here in the wilderness, she could almost taste the freedom that seemed so close yet so far. She had escaped, but she knew the Korvath would not give up so easily. They would send their forces after her, scouring the land for any sign of the prisoners who had slipped through their grasp. "We need to keep moving," Elias said quietly, his voice breaking through Kayla's thoughts. Kayla nodded, pushing the fear aside. She couldn't afford to dwell on what might happen. Right now, survival was all that mattered. They were on the run, and they had to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. The forest around them was dense, the trees pressing in on all sides. It felt like they were in a different world, far removed from the one they had left behind. The air was cooler here, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her lungs. There was a strange sense of peace in the wilderness, a stark contrast to the chaos of the prison. After hours of walking, Elias finally stopped, holding up a hand to signal that they should rest. Kayla collapsed onto the ground, her legs trembling from the strain. She leaned against a tree, trying to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the dark woods for any sign of danger. Elias knelt beside her, pulling out a small ration of food from his bag. It wasn't much, just a few dried fruits and a small piece of hard bread, but it was enough to give them the strength to keep going. Kayla accepted it gratefully, chewing slowly as they sat in the quiet of the night. "We should be close now," Elias said after a long silence, looking up at the stars above them. "The safe house is not far from here. Once we reach it, we'll be able to rest and plan our next move." Kayla felt a flicker of hope at his words. A safe house, a place where they could rest without the constant fear of being caught. It sounded too good to be true, but she knew Elias wouldn't lead her astray. If he said it was close, then she believed him. They finished their food in silence, each lost in their thoughts, and then Elias motioned for them to move again. The forest was quiet, but Kayla couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her nerves were on edge, but she kept moving, following Elias's lead. The path ahead was uncertain, but as long as they kept moving, they had a chance. After another hour of walking, Elias suddenly stopped, his hand outstretched to stop Kayla. She froze, heart pounding in her chest. Was it a trap? Had the Korvath found them? Elias's eyes scanned the trees, his sharp senses alert. After a few tense moments, he relaxed, lowering his hand. "It's just a bird," he whispered, his voice calm. "But stay alert. We're close now." Kayla exhaled in relief, but her heart was still racing. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, felt like a threat. She couldn't help it. She had been living in fear for so long that it was hard to shake the feeling of danger. "Keep close," Elias said, turning back toward the path. They moved swiftly now, the anticipation of safety driving them forward. It wasn't long before Kayla noticed a faint glow through the trees, a soft, warm light that seemed to beckon them. The sight made her heart skip a beat. Was this it? Were they really close to the safe house? Elias's pace quickened, and Kayla followed, her legs aching, but her spirit soaring. The glow grew brighter as they neared, and soon they came to a small clearing. In the center was a modest cabin, its windows glowing with the light of a fire inside. "We made it," Elias said, his voice filled with relief. "This is the safe house." Kayla could hardly believe it. After all the danger, the fear, the running, it was finally over. For now, at least, she felt a rush of gratitude toward Elias, for leading her to this place, for making all of this possible. The door to the cabin opened just as they approached, and a figure stepped out, a tall, lean man with graying hair and sharp eyes. He looked them over quickly, taking in their disheveled appearance and the tension in their bodies. But then his face softened, and he gave them a nod. "You made it. The man said, his voice deep and steady. "Come in, quickly. The Korvath won't be far behind." Elias and Kayla stepped into the cabin, the door closing quietly behind them. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a welcome relief, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. Kayla sank into a chair by the fire, feeling her body relax for the first time in what felt like forever. The man who had greeted them sat down across from them, his gaze assessing. "You're safe for now," he said, "but you've only just started. The Korvath will stop at nothing to find you. We'll need to keep moving soon." Kayla nodded, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself a moment of peace. They were safe for now, and with Elias by her side, she knew they would face whatever came next, together. Kayla sat by the fire, her eyes flickering over the flames, as she tried to process everything that had happened. It had been a whirlwind of escape, danger, and uncertainty, but now, in the quiet warmth of the safe house, she felt the first true sense of peace she had known in years. They had made it this far, against all odds. And now, for the first time in a long while, she could breathe. Elias sat beside her, his expression unreadable, but his presence was a constant reassurance. They were both exhausted, but there was a quiet confidence in him now, a sense that their fight was far from over, but that they could handle whatever came next. The man who had welcomed them into the cabin, his name was Garin, was sitting across the room, sharpening a knife. His eyes were focused on the blade, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere. He was part of the rebellion, and Kayla could tell that he was a man used to the weight of responsibility. He had seen battles, losses, and victories. He had probably been waiting for them, knowing the danger they faced. But still, Kayla felt a pang of guilt. They had dragged him into this fight without even asking. "Garin," Elias spoke up, breaking the silence. "What's our next move?" Garin looked up, his eyes sharp and calculating. "We stay here for a few days. The Korvath will be searching for you, but it will take them time to track your escape. We'll lay low, keep our heads down. But we can't stay here forever. We'll need to move before they come too close." Kayla's heart sank a little at the thought of running again. She had only just begun to relax, to allow herself the briefest taste of safety. But she knew Elias was right. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. "So what's the plan?" Kayla asked, her voice steady, though she felt a growing knot in her stomach. "How do we fight back?" Elias turned to her, his expression softening for a moment. "We don't fight them head-on. Not yet. We need to build our strength, find allies, and gather information. The Korvath have a stronghold on this planet, but they can be beaten. But first, we need to make sure we're ready." Kayla nodded, absorbing his words. She had never thought of herself as a fighter. Back in the prison, she had simply survived, doing what she could to get by. But now, she understood that survival wasn't enough. If she wanted to live freely, if she wanted to build a life that wasn't dictated by fear, she had to do more than just exist. She had to fight for it. "We'll need weapons," Garin added, his voice practical. "And information. The Korvath are not just brutal. They're clever. They know how to control a planet, how to crush any resistance before it even starts." Elias stood up, pacing slowly. "I know a place, a city not far from here, controlled by the rebellion. We can find what we need there. But it's dangerous. We'll need to be careful." Kayla looked up at Elias, her eyes meeting his. She could see the weight of his decisions on him, the burden of leadership, and the responsibility he felt for both their lives. But there was also something in his gaze, something stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. It was hope. "Are you ready?" he asked her, his voice gentle but firm. Kayla took a deep breath. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but one thing was certain. She couldn't turn back now. She had already made it this far, and there was no going back to the life she had known. The Korvath had taken so much from her already, her freedom, her family. But they wouldn't take her hope. They wouldn't take her future. "I'm ready," Kayla said, her voice steady, the words feeling stronger with each passing second. Elias gave a small nod, his expression softening. Then we fight. We rebuild. And we win. For the first time in a long while, Kayla smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph or of certainty, but a smile born of something new, a sense of possibility. They didn't know what the future held. They didn't know what dangers or challenges they would face. But for the first time in her life, Kayla felt like she had a choice. She could fight for the life she wanted. She could fight for her freedom. And she wouldn't have to do it alone. The next few days passed quickly as they prepared to leave the safe house. Garen shared what little he knew about the Corvette's movements, and Elias made plans for their journey into the city. They packed what little gear they had, food, water, and a few weapons Garen had given them, and set out under the cover of night. The road ahead was uncertain, and Kayla knew there was no guarantee of safety. But as they walked through the forest, the cold wind on her face and the stars above her, she felt a strange sense of peace. The fight for freedom wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in her life, Kayla believed that she could win.